Good morning, dear Sangha. Today is the 10th of June in the year 2012, and we are in the Assembly of Stars Meditation Hall, Lower Hamlet, during our 21-day retreat, The Signs of the Buddha. I think we shall have the first lotus flower blooming in maybe a week or so. We know that without the mud, lotus flowers cannot grow. The same thing is true with suffering and happiness. Without the mud, the suffering, you cannot create happiness. We create happiness out of suffering. And that is why we have to see the nature of interbeing between suffering and happiness. And looking into the flower of lotus, you see the mud. Looking into happiness, we should see suffering inside as an ingredient. And this is very, very clear in the teaching of the Buddha. The Four Noble Truths, they are linked to each other. And if you look into one of the Four Noble Truths, you see the other three. And our tendency to look for a place where there is no suffering is not very realistic. Even that place is called Pure Land of the Buddha or the Kingdom of God. And that is something that we can understand with our mind, our discriminative mind also. We can use our mind of discrimination in such a way that we can understand. Happiness is made of understanding and love and compassion. There are people who have plenty of money and power and fame, but they are not happy. In fact, many of them commit suicide. If you do not have love and understanding in yourself, you are completely cut off. Without compassion and understanding, you can relate to any other person. And that is why we can say that understanding and love are two very basic ingredients for happiness. And a practitioner is someone who is capable of nourishing, generating the energy of understanding and love. But how to generate understanding and love? And the answer of the Buddha is to touch suffering. Understanding, first of all, is understanding of suffering, your own suffering. That carries within it the suffering of your father, your mother, your ancestors, and also the suffering of the world. So understanding the suffering in ourselves will help us to understand the suffering of our parents, our ancestors, and the world. And with the energy of mindfulness and concentration, we can go home to ourselves and recognize the suffering and learn to embrace the suffering deeply, tenderly. And we can do that because we have the energy of mindfulness and concentration generated by the practice of breathing, of walking, and so on. Those who do not practice, they don't have the energy of mindfulness and concentration. That is why they are afraid of going home to recognize and embrace the suffering in themselves. So the basic practice is walking, breathing, eating, cooking, washing. We have to do it in mindfulness so that we can generate the energy of mindfulness and concentration. And with that energy, we can go home without fear to ourselves and recognize the suffering and listen to it. Suffering in Chinese, the word suffering in Chinese, it means bitterness. It means also bitterness. There's a kind of melon called bitter melon. It tastes very good. Dukkha, and we in English we like to use the word ill being, rather than suffering. Ill being, le mal-être. And according to the law of symmetry, the law of interbeing, suffering cannot be there unless something is there at the same time. It's like the left and the right. The left cannot be there without the right. The inside cannot be there without the outside. That is the law. This is the teaching of Buddhism, interbeing, tương đại. So suffering is there, it means something else is there, somewhere, very close. That is happiness, that is well-being. This is, we are training ourselves to look at reality in another way. This is training. The Chinese word is lac, it means happiness. And suffering and happiness, they inter-are. It's like the mud and the lotus. Without the mud, there is no lotus. Without suffering, there is no happiness. So when we confirm the presence of suffering, we confirm the presence of something else that is very much linked to suffering, that is happiness, that is sukha. And we translate it as well-being, le bien-être. And in the basic teaching of the Buddha, ill-being is the first noble truth, and well-being is the third noble truth. They go together. Because the third noble truth is the transformation of suffering, the cessation of suffering. It means the presence of well-being. There is a way to transform, to make use of the mud in order to produce the lotus. And of course, the second truth is the making of ill-being, the path leading to ill-being. If you do not know the art of living, you make mistakes and you create suffering. And that is the second noble truth, the making of suffering, the path leading to suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the path leading to well-being. It's simple, And this is the eight noble eightfold path, and beginning with right view. And yesterday we already have a good definition of right view, the kind of insight, the kind of view that is free from the notion of being and non-being. For that sutra, we need only to remember one thing. The sutra on the middle way teaches us that the view of being and non-being is misleading, and they prevent us to see reality as it is. So remove the notion of being and non-being, we begin to see the reality. In the conventional realm of truth, we say that there is and there is not. We can say to be or not to be is the question. But when we want to go further, touching the ultimate, we have to leave behind the notion of being and non-being. Otherwise, you cannot touch the ultimate truth. And that is why in the ultimate dimension, you can say to be or not to be, that is no longer the question. It was a question when you was at the realm of conventional truth. But when you touch the ultimate truth, it's no longer a question, because you are free from both being and non-being. You cannot define the ultimate. You cannot define the God in terms of being and non-being. To say that God is not right, and to say that God is not right either, because the ultimate is free from both notions. And the practice of the path should be based on that view, the view of interbeing, the view of the view that is free from the notion of being and non-being, and then free from the notion of birth and death also. And that is something we have to cultivate. But now let's come back to the first noble truth, dukkha. When you go back to your suffering, whether it is fear or anger or despair or jealousy, and listen deeply to it, you begin to understand how it has been made. It means you begin to understand, to see the second noble truth. The way we live our daily life, the way we think, the way we act, the way we speak, that is based on discrimination, based on these notions, have created separation, anger, suffering for us and for the other person. So we begin to see the second noble truth, the way of life that has led to ill being. And when you begin to see the second noble truth, understanding arises. And understanding arises, bring together with it compassion. Understanding suffering always brings compassion. And suddenly you suffer less right away. Because with the energy of understanding and compassion, there is already transformation. You have not done anything yet. The energy of understanding and compassion alone can make you suffer less right away. You have seen the nature of suffering. And you do not blame yourself anymore. And you do not blame him or her anymore. Because you know that you are and he is not responsible for that. What is responsible for that is the way of living, the way of thinking, the way of acting, the way of talking. And when we have seen the second noble truth, understanding and compassion arise, and we suffer less right away, we feel lighter. And that is why the lotus is made of mud. Happiness is made of suffering. So it is very clear that understanding and love, ingredients for happiness, are born only from your getting in touch with suffering and understanding suffering. Without suffering, you cannot create happiness. Without the mud, you cannot create lotus. This is very clear, and you see the connection between the two, ill-being and well-being. Without the left, there is no right. There is no right. Without suffering, there is no happiness. So imagine there is a place where there is no suffering. There is a place where there is no mud. You cannot grow lotus. You cannot grow happiness. Suppose you speak of the kingdom of God is a place where there is no suffering. And you find that it's a very naive idea. If there is no suffering, how can you generate the energy of understanding and compassion? And without the energy of understanding and compassion, there is no happiness. And you believe that the kingdom of God is a place where there is happiness. Happiness is born from what? Happiness is born from understanding and love, understanding and compassion. Understanding, first of all, is understanding suffering. When you love someone, you have to understand his suffering. Otherwise, you cannot love him. The foundation of love is understanding. Understanding is, first of all, understanding suffering. So if you want to really love him or her and make him or her happy, you have to understand his suffering. You have to use your mindfulness and concentration to look and identify the kind of suffering that that person has in him or her. And look deeply to see how that suffering has been brought to him or to her. That is an act of love. Looking and recognizing the suffering in that person. And if you need, you can seek for help. You say, darling, I want to understand you more. And I want to understand more about your difficulty and your suffering. I want to listen to you because I want to love you. And the other person may have a chance to tell you about her suffering, her difficulties. And with that understanding, your love will deepen and become true love. And that is why suffering is the foundation, is the ingredient that is essential for the generation of understanding and love. And in any relationship, you may like to check whether you have understand the other person. If it is a relationship that is harmonious, where communication is good, and then happiness is possible. And if communication and harmony exist, it means mutual understanding is there. And that is why it may be important to ask the other person, darling, do you think that I understand you enough? we feel that we already understand him or her deeply. That's not correct. We do not understand, we have not understood ourselves, even ourselves. We have not understood our own suffering. How can we understand his or her suffering? So we should not be sure that we understand everything about him or her. No. We have to ask the question, do I understand myself enough? My suffering, the roots of my suffering. And if you have some understanding and insight about your suffering, you begin to be a good lover, because you know how to love and accept yourself. If you cannot accept yourself, if you hate yourself, if you get angry at yourself, how can you love another person? And that is why self-understanding is very crucial for understanding another person. Self-love is crucial for the love of another person. And when you have understood your suffering and you suffer less, you are capable of understanding his and her suffering much more easily. And when you are able to recognize the suffering in her, in him, and see how that suffering has come to her or to him, compassion arises also in you and your heart. And you do not have any more the intention to punish, to blame that person anymore. The way you look at him, the way you look at her, there is compassion and understanding in it. When you look at someone with compassion, with understanding, you don't suffer. And the other person, when look like that, feel very comfortable, because there is understanding and love in your eyes. And when you look at someone and see the suffering and the making of the suffering, you are no longer motivated by the desire to retaliate or to punish, but you have now the intention to do something or to say something to help that person to suffer less. It means you have compassion in you. That is true love. That is why going home to understand suffering in us and understand the making, the root of suffering in us is the first step. It is to do with the first noble truth. And when we have come to understand our own suffering and the making of our own suffering, we are in a position to help the other person to suffer less. Understanding our own suffering, we can understand his or her suffering much more easily. And when we understand, suddenly compassion arises. And that is true love. Love is the kind of energy that can help the other person to suffer less and to begin to feel happiness. Love is the kind of energy that can help you suffer less and begin to taste the taste of happiness. And suffering plays a very important role in love. That is why the kingdom of God or the Pure Land of Buddha, according to me, is not a place where there is no suffering. It is a place where people know how to make good use of suffering in order to create happiness. In the kingdom of God, in the Pure Land of Buddha, there are those who can educate us how to make good use of the mud to grow lotus. In the kingdom of God, in the Pure Land of Buddha, there are bodhisattvas, great people, great beings, who know how to make good use of suffering in order to create happiness. And when happiness is disintegrated into suffering again, they know how to recreate happiness. And that is why if we know how to handle happiness, how to handle suffering, if we know how to make good use of happiness, of suffering in order to create happiness, we are inhabitants of the kingdom of God, of the Pure Land of the Buddha. And we should recognize the kingdom of God, the Pure Land of Buddha, by that kind of criterions. A place where people know how to handle suffering, how to make good use of suffering in order to create happiness, because both happiness and suffering are of organic nature. So your relationship with him, with her, depends on your capacity and his capacity to understand suffering in each person and in the other person. And knowing how to handle suffering, you know at the same time how to produce happiness. And if you are happy, all of us will profit from your happiness. We need happy people in this world. The fourth mindfulness training is about compassionate listening and loving speech. This is a very wonderful instrument in order to establish, to restore communication and to help relieve suffering. In every retreat, we should help people practice mindfulness of suffering, recognizing suffering in oneself and recognizing suffering in the other person. Because recognizing and embracing suffering can give rise to understanding and compassion. And we can succeed in a few days. We usually offer retreats of mindfulness 5 days, 6 days, a week. And the Dhamma talk and the practice of breathing and walking and looking deeply has the power, has the capacity to help us water the seed of understanding and compassion in us by touching the suffering in oneself. And if we have some difficulty in our relationship with the other person, and if the other person is not in the retreat, we can always meditate in order to see, recognize the suffering in him or in her. That person may have done something or may have said something that makes you suffer. And if you know how to recognize the suffering in him or in her, that could be very helpful. When someone suffers and does not know how to handle the suffering in himself or herself, he becomes the victim of his own suffering. He cannot get out of that suffering. He cannot transform that suffering. And he can make other people around him suffer, around her suffer. It's not his intention to make you suffer. You suffer because that person does not know how to handle the suffering in himself. And that is why his suffering is spilled over and you become the second victim. It's not his intention to make you suffer. You have to see that. And that person needs help. That person does not need punishment. What that person needs is help. And who is going to help him? You. You are a practitioner. You have to help yourself first, and then you will help him or her. If we know how to handle the suffering in us, if we can understand the nature of our own suffering, we suffer less. We feel lighter. We accept ourselves. We do not blame ourselves. We are at peace with ourselves. And you are in position to help him. You want him or her to do like you. And that is why you use the fourth mindfulness training. You come to him and say, darling, I know you suffer. And in the past, I did not understand that suffering. And I have reacted in such a way that make you suffer more and I suffer more. It's not my intention to make you suffer, dear one. It's because I did not understand your suffering. And I did not understand my suffering either. Now the situation is better. I have understood my suffering. And I want to understand your suffering. Because understanding your suffering, your difficulties will help me to behave in such a way that can be helpful. So if you really care for me, please help me. Tell me of what is in your heart. I want to listen. I want to understand. Tell me about your suffering, your difficulties. If you do not help me, who will? That is loving speech. And when you have the energy of compassion in your heart, you can use that speech very easily. It comes very naturally. There are many people who hate their father, who can never say something sweet to their father. And yet after a few days of practice, looking at their own suffering and the suffering of their father, they were able to use loving speech. On the fourth day, everyone in the retreat was urged to apply what they learned in the retreat in order to restore communication. If the other person is in the retreat, that is much easier. Because that person has been exposed to the teaching, that person has practiced. But if the other person is at home, and then you can use your portable telephone in order to practice the fourth mindfulness training. You have to practice breathing, walking, so that you are calm, that you can understand your own suffering and his or her suffering. And when you hold the telephone, you are sure that you have seen the suffering in your father, in your partner. And in just 3-4 days, there is transformation. And when you compose a number and you hear his voice, suddenly you find yourself capable of speaking like that, using the language of loving kindness. Daddy, I know that you have suffered a lot during the last many years. I could not help you. I only made the situation worse. I have reacted with anger and stubbornness because I did not understand your difficulty, your suffering. It's not my intention, Daddy, to make you suffer. It's about my ignorance, about my own suffering and your suffering. Now I have understood some are suffering. I feel much better. And I would like to know that it's not my intention to make you suffer, Father. Just because I did not understand your suffering, so please help me. If you don't help me, who will? Tell me, Daddy, about your suffering, your difficulties. And they find it natural that they can speak like that, just after 3-4 days of practice. And when you speak like that, the heart of the other person will open right away. And that person will tell you, and now you practice deep listening, compassionate listening. And 1 hour of listening like that will heal him, heal her very quickly. You are the Bodhisattva of deep listening. The Bodhisattva Avalokita is not on the sky. He is in your heart. If you know how to listen with compassion, you can heal. You can heal him, you can heal her, and you can heal yourself. That is why we should know how to make good use of the 4th mindfulness training, using loving speech and deep listening. The Bodhisattva of deep listening is in your heart. The seed of understanding, the seed of compassion are well in you. And we need mindfulness in order to touch off these seeds, in order to be able to understand, to be compassionate. And suddenly we find ourselves capable of talking like that and listening like that in order to restore communication and to heal. In any relationship, this is possible. Even between 2 groups of people, 2 nations, the practice of deep listening and the use of loving speech is very important. The Dhamma talk yesterday may be a little bit difficult for some of us, but please don't worry. I assure that you will understand. What seems to not to be easy to understand is that there is action, but there is no actor. Because we are used to think in terms of self. And yesterday we mentioned the famous sentence of Descartes, "Je pense, donc je suis, I think, therefore I am." According to this insight, there is the thinking is there, but the thinker, you are not sure that there's such a thing that exists outside of the thinking. The action is there. The feeling is there, but you cannot find a feeler. And then if we look into the discoveries of science, we see plenty of things that can confirm this. When we speak of our brain, of the neurons that are working together, many people have used the image of an orchestra to speak of the brain. A multitude of neurons are communicating with each other, interacting with each other, exchanging information, and together they produce thought, feelings, ideas, and notions. And you cannot identify any neuron as the subject, the boss. It is like an orchestra, but there is no conductor at all. The same thing is true with a beehive. There are many bees working together like that. There is no director. The queen bee is not the boss. Her duty is to give, to produce eggs, larves for the next generation. So there is really no self behind, no actor behind. And looking into our body, we see the same. There are a multitude of cells working together. There is no boss. There is no proprietor. There is no actor. There is no receiver of the action. And in this sutra, you only remember that a few words. The sutra on the ultimate meaning of emptiness, page 14.